Vignettes with Reddit, story time. My personal experience with a murderer. Hi all, I hope this is a good sub to post in. I posted elsewhere and someone suggested posting here. In this particular crime the perpetrator is thankfully behind bars, but I still struggle with the why of it all. So my part of the story starts in 2009 and I was a junior in high school. I lived in a small town in Ohio. In the fall I started to date my first real boyfriend, John. John was a senior and many of his friends were dating my friends, and he is well liked and funny at school. I'm thrilled about the relationship, especially because my strict parents seem to like John as well. He's pretty quiet around them but always polite and appreciative in their presence. Since it's a small town, John lived literally down the street, and we hung out all the time. My parents were actually getting divorced at the time, so I liked spending time at his place more than mine. John lived with Chris, a man who wasn't his biological dad but someone he had lived with since around age 13 and often called Dad. Chris was an adolescence counselor who knew John because he had been in foster care, and he had taken John in. Chris was an amazing human who was fun to be around, and it was just the two of them and their pug Murphy at the house. I didn't know much about John's childhood at first other than it had clearly been rough enough for him to be involved with children's services. Anyways, we spent a lot of time together, and always had a good time with Chris as well. Eventually John confided in me that he often had suicidal thoughts. I was shook by this and I told Chris about it as well. We continued to date and I did my best to support him. So the next year I'm a senior and John has graduated, but he's not really doing anything. He didn't go to college and his plans to join the military weren't working out, so he's just living with Chris and working a part-time job that my dad had gotten for him. I've always been into school and extracurriculars, and I felt like John was holding me back. Our relationship was going downhill in many ways, but I was scared if I broke it off John might really kill himself. He had threatened to do so when I tried. In May 2011 I graduated high school and decided I had to leave the relationship behind. I was having my own depression issues, and John was having a detrimental effect on my mental health. I finally told him we had to break up and he needed to stop contacting me threatening self-harm. I mostly cut off contact, and a couple months later I got an apartment with a friend about 30 minutes away from home and beside the college I was attending. One Friday night in April 2012 I'm in my hometown to see a friend, and I pass John's house where I see police cars everywhere. I'm shocked and assume John must have attempted suicide, so I immediately call our mutual friend Kyle. Kyle has no clue what's going on with John, and he says that John had hung out at his house the day before. Kyle said John seemed like he was in a good mood, especially because he was driving Chris's Beamer at the time, which he loved to do. Anyways, Kyle is actually chilling at my apartment with my roommate. This is normal as he had a crush on her, so I just keep driving that way. When I get to my place Kyle hasn't heard anything, but my mom calls me with the scoop. She's friends with cop wives, small town stuff. It turns out that John murdered Chris, and was on the run somewhere. Someone had called for a wellness check after not hearing from Chris for a while, and the cops found his body at home. I was shocked, and a little scared, as were Kyle and my roomie, so we all decide to stay at my roommate's parents' house for the night. By morning the cops had luckily found and arrested John. He had taken the Beamer, so it was easily spotted at a run-down motel about 15 miles from his home, about 12 miles from our apartment. When the details came out the whole thing was even more horrifying. It was a brutal homicide, and it had occurred days before the body was found. Which means that John was just hanging out at Kyle's house between committing this act and getting arrested. Just nonchalantly playing video games, telling jokes to Kyle's little sister, acting like everything was fine. Meanwhile he had stuffed Chris's body in their freezer at home. It's insane to think about how someone could be such a psychopath. And there was really no explanation given. John initially tried to plead insanity, but he was eventually deemed competent and then pleaded guilty. He got 30 to life in prison. I've obviously told this story from my perspective, but the person who really matters in this is of course the victim. Chris was truly a saint of a human being. He had been my role model for so many years, and you just wonder how could something so horrific could happen to someone so good? And at the hands of someone they had given everything to. Someone they had loved, trusted, and seen as a son. It's horrifying. Chris spent his life advocating for kids like John, and the local center he worked at is actually named after him now, as is the street that it is on. As I said to begin, I often wonder about the why of it all. Chris and John got along almost all of the time, and though John clearly had mental health issues, no one thought he would hurt anyone but himself. But clearly something was very wrong with John that we missed. They say hindsight is 20/20, and I can definitely look back and think of a few strange instances with John. Sneaky, manipulative, and angry. He eventually showed all of those traits, but I was lucky enough not to experience any violence at his hands. I wish I could say the same for Chris. I'm thankful for the time I did spend with him and the positive impact he had on my life during that time. I know he had a positive effect on so many other lives as well. May he rest in peace. I'm in awe and shock. I noticed my hand doing the serious ponder clasp around my chin. I am so sorry. I don't know why these things happen, but if you are dating anyone now/single, please do a background check on people. I mean, I get you didn't on John cause he was a high school relationship, but don't ever get your worth and value twisted with his psychotic rage. It may not help, but my ex-husband is a pedophile. It does make me feel better knowing others out there who've had brushes with heinous criminals turned out okay. I hope you are doing well now that he is an ex-husband. In my quarantine mode I watched the Netflix movie about Ted Bundy's girlfriend, and it's what prompted me to write this. It struck a weird chord with me and got me thinking about all of this again. I dunno, we can't assume the relationship between John and Chris was as it seemed from the outside. Clearly there was tension there that we weren't seeing. I know John still hadn't been doing anything productive at this time, had lost at least a job or two, and I had heard rumors he was abusing some type of substance, but that's not something I have the details on. I'm sure Chris was doing his best to push John into doing more with his life, and John did always have a bit of a hard time with authority, you could say. He never got into any huge trouble while we were together, but he definitely did not like being told what to do by Chris or anyone else, even if it was in his best interest. I'm sure this played into the dynamic in some way. If I had to say what happened, I'd guess Chris was telling him to get his shit together. John was 20 and could barely hold down a minimum wage job anymore, and it enraged John, who acted violently. Chris was a pretty small guy, it wouldn't have been equally matched at all. He had taken John in as a young person to give him a more stable living situation. He had been a foster dad before this and never had any issues. Helping troubled kids was literally his job as well. He had a master's in counseling and was the director at the local child and adolescent center. He was on the board of the county children's services as well. Of course there's instances where upstanding citizens are found to be something sinister, but I truly do not think that was the case here. That's such a wild and crazy story. You didn't even have just a personal experience, in my opinion. An experience is a moment. You dated this guy for years. I spent summers with a guy as a child, who was my mother's friend's son. This family friend would watch me when I was young, but her son would torment me daily, vicious name-calling, leaving me behind in places. It was a little more than just older boy giving the little girl a hard time. He later was to commit murder, I believe in the first degree. When his friend died, he freaked out and set his friend's body on fire while he was technically still alive and dumped his body in a swamp. I look back now and of course it's 2020. He may not have set out to kill a man, but the way he did it was cruel and grotesque. It's unreal to think these people have the potential all along to do these things. Really crazy. That's insane and very sad. Some people are very evil at a young age. It makes you wonder if there's a chance for them to ever be rehabilitated into a normal adult. Looking back, I think John had dark tendencies in him from early on, even though he seemed pretty normal from the outside. I say this mostly because after the fact I heard a thing or two about him having a bit of a juvenile record and stories of him bullying other kids when he was younger. It's honestly pretty hazy, especially mixed in with the few stories he told me that may or may not be true, but I remember hearing a couple disturbing stories and rumors of his younger days. Editing this to update, I found his juvenile record and it's just as awful as I remember hearing about after the fact. It's in the article at the very bottom of my post. Thank you for watching the video. If you're new, please be sure to subscribe, like and turn on post notifications so you never miss an upload. Post your own stories in the comments down below.